This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk Live. I'm Rob Port. We are going to be discussing marijuana on today's show. It's been a years-long debate in the state of North Dakota, at least in earnest, legalizing recreational marijuana. Now, obviously, we've already legalized medicinal marijuana. There are establishments selling medicinal marijuana across the state. The debate now is legalized recreational marijuana, or at the very least, decriminalized recreational marijuana. Now, the legislature had this debate earlier this year. The legislature is obviously still in session. Those initiatives did well in the House, even despite being sponsored by some people who said that they were, at best, lukewarm about having legalized recreational marijuana, that it wasn't even necessarily something that they wanted. They passed bills in the State House of Representatives, but it got to the Senate, and the wheels came off. No legalized recreational marijuana, no decriminalized recreational marijuana, and in fact, even a last-ditch effort to turn it into a sort of ballot question about whether or not North Dakotans want recreational marijuana, that failed as well. Here to talk with me about it is David Owen. He has been a... No, I should transition to the right screen here. David Owen joins me. He's been a longtime proponent of legalized recreational marijuana. He's part of the organizer behind Legalize ND in our state. They had a ballot measure in the past that wasn't successful, but would have legalized recreational marijuana. And I assume what you're going to tell me as we begin this discussion is that we're going to get another ballot measure on this, and more than one, almost certainly.
I think there's only going to be one. I don't think the other one's going to make the ballot. And that's kind of part of why the wheels fell off, as you say, in the Senate. But Legalize ND is definitely preparing a ballot initiative. We're going to be running something that is substantively similar to what we were going to run prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. For those unaware, we had started the signature collecting process approximately December 24th, so is when we got approved. So right before Christmas of 2019, we formally start collecting just after New Year's of 2020. We get to March, we're on quota, and then the COVID pandemic hits. We call for a temporary suspension of collecting, and then temporary turned into, well, you all know what happened with COVID. And so we had to suspend the effort. I believe we suspend in April. So we're going to run that again because people never got to vote on it, and we think it was a good bill. It was written by Legislative Counsel and West Fargo attorney Scott Brand. So it had all the T's crossed and I's dotted, so that's what we're going to run.
All right, well, it's going to be an interesting debate. Let's talk, before we get into what comes next, let's talk about what happened in the legislature because... And obviously you follow this a lot more closely than I did. But as I saw it coming out of the House, I thought it had good momentum. And I thought that passage in the Senate seemed likely. Obviously, it's the legislative process. Weird things can happen. But I had a very good outlook on it coming out of the House. So tell us, what happened? Why did we lose momentum coming out of the House and into the Senate?
So the House and the Senate were two different scenarios, really, that people conflate as the same scenario. In the House, you had about 27 legislators who were strongly in favor of full legalization, and you had about, call it, 20 who were begrudging but fine. And maybe you can kick that number as high as 30 legislators who were very in favor of it. And so as a result, in the House, there were people who were advocating that not just as an inevitable, it's also a good idea. In the Senate, by way of comparison, you only have probably 7 legislators who think it's a good idea, and the rest were operating under this fear of a ballot initiative. Well, when the first hearing happens, you have multiple people come in, Senate side, and the entire conversation is about how credible and how serious is this threat of a ballot initiative. And people forget there are 2 initiative groups. There's Legalize ND, which hadn't started yet because we were going to wait to see, as per our promise to the legislature. And then there was the Cannabis Caucus. Maybe they're going by ND for Freedom now. They've gone by a bunch of different names. And they had started in December of 21. And at the time of that hearing, they had updated their website to show they only had 500 signatures. And their main spokesman was a well-known, we'll call him far-left activist. I think that's fair. Dustin Pyre, who's run for just about everything at this point. He's the rights equivalent of Coachman, is the joke I like to make. And so he comes in wearing a marijuana flag, and they discover there's no threat.
You're referring to Michael Coachman, who's often he's been a lieutenant governor candidate. He's run for governor. He's run for secretary of state. Very, I would say, very much in the Bastiat sort of fringe right part of the politics. Anyway, go ahead.
And so this guy, who's the left-wing equivalent, again, very well-intentioned, comes in wearing a marijuana flag, and his group releases their signature numbers that they're averaging 250 signatures a month. 250 signatures a month is nowhere near enough to get anything on the ballot. To get a statutory, you need to average between 1,500 to 2,000, and to get a constitutional, you need to average about 3 to 4, depending on the rejection rates and when exactly you start. And so what the Senate sees is these people aren't credible. They're not serious. They don't have any signatures. They can't get anyone to buy what they're selling. And so there's no threat. And when there's no threat, the thing collapses because the inevitability factor disappears.
So essentially what you're saying is a lot of what was motivating the number of lawmakers that you would have needed maybe to get this over the top. A lot of the lawmakers were motivated by fear of a ballot measure, which is to say, if we don't do this, somebody's going to write a ballot measure. And as we've seen from the history of ballot measures, a lot of time that results in maybe not so great policy. And we had a lot of problems with the medicinal marijuana ballot measure where the legislature had to come in. They had to make a lot of fixes. And they didn't get a lot of thanks for that process. They had a lot of people, even as they were trying to turn the law into something that was workable, they had marijuana activists sort of on their left flank screaming at them and accusing them of doing all sorts of nefarious things. That was a thankless job for them. I think they thought, well, if we're gonna legalize it anyway, if that's the way the political winds are blowing, then let's do it ourselves. We'll write the law better, and it'll be workable. And obviously, what's better or worse is going to be a subjective thing when it comes to this policy. But essentially, what you're saying is this other group, what you're calling the Cannabis Caucus, came in, and by producing their signature numbers, they made a lot of lawmakers feel like it wasn't maybe as inevitable as they thought.
Right, because when you only have 500 signatures over 2 months, and you need to be at 6,000 by the end of that second month, it shows that you're not making any forward progress. What their signature counts would suggest is that momentum has stalled and or died on the issue. And the problem isn't that momentum has stalled and or died. The problem is the people pushing it on that side, quite frankly, don't know what they're doing. And so when you release really low numbers, you see, well, this is just 500 people. This isn't going to make the ballot. I think Kristen Rohrs even stated in one of the hearings, at the rate they're going, it'll take them 100 years to make the ballot. And she was being facetious a little bit. But that was then the mindset. Well, they're not credible. They're not going to make the ballot. There's no way they can at this rate.
And let's be honest. You had a ballot initiative previously that failed as well.
Right, 40.5 to 51.5, 41, 59, and if you're feeling credible.
So and again, I don't agree with this point of view. I think that legalization of recreational marijuana is inevitable. I think if you look at moral society's feelings about marijuana have just changed radically, and it's coming. I think the question is when and how. But the legislature, I guess, got the feeling that they could kick the can down the road because some of the activists who were involved in the ballot measure campaign made it pretty clear they weren't doing such a great job getting signatures, which I can tell you it's not a good metric, I think, for how popular the issue is, because collecting signatures is really, really hard. We have a lot of groups in our state that make it look easy because they come in and they drop hundreds of thousands of dollars on paying people to go out and collect their signatures for them. And if you're paying people to collect your signatures, well then yeah, getting the signatures you need is easy. When you're relying on activists who are, working all day and then they're going out and trying to collect signatures for an hour or so before going home and making dinner, or they're using their Saturday to do it, it's a lot harder to get a lot of signatures coming in. So,
Well, I would disagree, Rob, because Legalize ND, when we made the ballot in 2018, we spent $13,000 to make the ballot. And about half of that was on media travel, and half of that was on advertising, PR. We had a fundraiser here, and all that. This issue, it's fairly easy to make the ballot. We were spending less than $1 per signature with all volunteers. But the thing is, you have to know the times, you have to know where to collect, you have to know how to collect. So to do a true volunteer effort, you're going door to door every weekend, knocking doors.
yeah, well, that's my
You're
point.
sitting-
It's hard work. Like your group and these other, you're not in a position to just write a check to a consultant to just go out there and collect the signatures. It takes a lot of work, and you have a group that maybe doesn't realize that. Because I've been a part of, years and years and years ago, I've been a part of ballot initiative campaigns before, and that's a hard thing. Is you get a lot of people who are all, oh yeah, I'll go out, I'll collect all these signatures, and then they don't follow through because it's actually a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And-
3 or 4 people usually collect half the signatures.
Yeah.
In volunteer-led efforts.
Yeah, that's pretty typical. So that's what happened in the Senate. Why? Because there was a pretty extraordinary effort right at the end, and you had the Senate Majority Leader, backing the play. I mean, if you're going to have somebody, with influence in the Senate, the Majority Leader is a pretty good person to have. They had that extraordinary effort right at the end to try to put the question on the ballot, and even that failed. Which surprised me. I thought with the Majority Leader backing the play, I thought for sure they would get that through.
Well, Rich Wardener has lost all credibility on this issue. He told the forum famously that he was going to vote yes on 1420. He said that he's a supporter, he's voting yes on it, and that he thought most of his colleagues were. So Wardener clearly is not a credible source on this issue. That's unfortunate. Also, if you're in the hearings and you actually read the measure that Senator Dever was going to put on the ballot, it was actually a bit of a trap. It was a very cynical play to try and undermine a ballot initiative. Because if you read how it's written, there are a couple very nuanced things. The first is that it uses the word cannabis. So technically, hemp is legal cannabis. Hemp is cannabis which contains less than 0.3% THC. So his bill says, shall create rules and provisions for the sale, distribution, and manufacture of cannabis. We already have that in North Dakota because we have an industrial hemp program. It also didn't give a deadline to the legislature. So when will they do it? Well, they don't have to do it by a certain date. And if the law doesn't specify when, then they can just do it whenever the heck they want. They can do it when everyone here on this call is dead in 2099. And also they didn't clarify the adult use problem. What's an adult? Is it 18? Is it 21? Is it 26 when your brain's done developing? That thing gave them so much leeway that it was really a cynical effort to try and say, let's not actually do it.
So your idea is they were going to put this on the ballot, and if that question is on the ballot, it then becomes difficult to put a separate legalization measure on the ballot because you run the risk of confusing voters. And you could split the vote. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff that could happen when you start putting multiple things on the same ballot like that. We see that with candidates, where you have third-party candidates come in. They can act as spoilers sometimes. Do you think that's what it was? It was just an attempt to muddy the waters and kick the can down the road?
100%, because if they had wanted to, what they could have done is they could have referred 1420 directly to the people. Because they could have written it in such a way that said the legislature shall enact a cannabis law which was previously known as House Bill 1420. They could have said that. There's a reason they chose not to. And House Bill 1420 is about as restrictive of a cannabis law as you can get. You can't get much stricter.
Would you have been, I mean, you supported 1420, though. I mean, again, I know a lot of people, they didn't like it, but it kind of seemed the compromise of what was possible. But it was restrictive.
I fully supported 1420, not because I felt it was a great bill, but because it was solving what is my number one problem with the war on drugs, and that is people getting criminal records for marijuana possession. And my attitude was, this solves this today. We can fix the rest later. And so I was as much as the legislature was a begrudging supporter of marijuana legalization, I was a begrudging supporter of 1420.
Well, it was a foot in the door, and that was back when we were having the debate over medicinal marijuana. That was one of my complaints about it, is that even as the ballot was written, even as the measure was written by its supporters, was so hugely bureaucratic. I mean, to my mind, you just legalize it, like just get it done. And understanding, of course, there's some questions. What's the age? Is it 18? Is it 21? Do we need probably some regulations? There's the whole ongoing federal prohibition, which complicates everything because you don't want to run afoul of the feds, and derail a good state level legalization by running afoul of the feds. Which, by the way, the federal government needs to just end their prohibition and leave this up to the states. That just needs to happen. But all right, so going forward, what happens next, David?
What happens next is we sit and wait for a couple of months because of a weird procedural quirk. So if you submit your final finished petition prior to a certain date, you're put on the primary ballot and not the general election ballot. That is very unfavorable to us. The primary ballot has virtually no turnout among younger voters. It has virtually no turnout among what I would call liberal-leaning Republicans. It has virtually no turnout amongst Democrats. And as a result, when you have no turnout of your entire constituency, you don't want it on that ballot. So we are going to submit no earlier than July, because that allows us to go on the general. Now, there are internal talks about maybe there were some provisions of the bill that we were going to run that we want to change. There's always the home grow fight. It's never fun. There's always the expungement of records fight. That's another not fun one where people get emotional. And after everyone kind of sitting in a room and arguing with each other for a couple of hours, we take the Christmas tree and we prune it to what's reality. And so we'll probably have to do a Christmas tree meeting where everyone wants to add their stuff back in, and we'll probably prune it. And then we will submit it to the Secretary of State. Realistically, August is the earliest. These things typically run long. We typically submit in December, and then you collect signatures for July. And as part of that, we're going to be doing some polling very privately, and we're trying to figure out what the lay of the land is and what provisions are and aren't popular.
What do you expect that the measure is going to look like? Because obviously you had Measure 3, your previous effort, which it had a very strong showing. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing it. It got over 40% of the vote, but obviously 40% doesn't cut the mustard. So, are there elements of that you're going to work on? I mean, give us an idea of what legalization in terms of your measure could look like.
The best thing I can refer you to is the measure that we were running in 2020 that got canceled due to COVID. It's going to look much more similar to that than Measure 3. The only big provision from Measure 3 that may make it in is home grow. And we don't know where that's going to sit. There are some people that want it very passionately. There are some people that are passionately against it. There are some people who say, look, it's not politically feasible. And so what usually happens is, as part of our poll, we ask about home grow, and that's what informs the question. So that's what we're really waiting on, is a nice poll to see where we're at with home grow. But it's going to look much more like 2020 than Measure 3.
What are your what are the big differences going to be from what was considered 1420 in the Senate, or excuse me, in the legislature?
The most obvious one is we're not going to have papers, please. You're not going to have to register with the state as a recreational user. You're not going to have an ID card which tracks every single purchase you make at a dispensary. You're not going to be limited to buying only an ounce every 2 weeks. There will be a possession limit, but it won't be you can only buy this much every 2 weeks. There will also be some changes in how they decided to do the criminal structure, and there will be some changes to dispensary licensing. We're going to go much more local control, whereas they went state control with a flavor of local control.
Do you and by the way, the provisions of the papers please provisions, as you refer to them, were ridiculous. And again, that's something that frustrates me. If you're gonna do it, then do it. And I understand maybe the politics behind it, where they're trying to buy off some of the skeptics and get them over on some form of legalization that maybe we can knock off some of the hard edges in the future. But I mean, at some point, I think you just got to say, if this is gonna, which is why I don't like marijuana decriminalization. It's like saying, well, it's still illegal, but it's kind of not. We're just gonna kind of work the. Don't do that. Pick a lane. It's either legal or it ain't. And if it's legal, then we can have rational regulation of it. We could say you got to be this age to use it. This is where it can be sold, and some basic regulation. But beyond that, if it's legal, just let it be legal.
Well put. Decriminalization has all of the problems of a criminal market with none of the real benefits of legalization. Because in a decriminalized structure, what you usually do is you still make the manufacture and sale a felony of some description. That's what every state that decriminalizes marijuana has done. And as a result, what ends up happening is the only people that can sell it are the cartels, but the consumer faces no risk for possession. So you now have a pseudo-legal market where the only vendor is the cartel. And so even more money floods to the cartel.
Yeah. No, and that's the big thing that we got to get rid of. I mean, I want capitalists selling marijuana. I don't want criminal enterprises selling marijuana, right? I think you look at alcohol. For all the deleterious impacts that alcohol sales have on society, and they do, and I'm 100% in favor of alcohol being legal. I don't have a problem. I'm not judging people who use alcohol, but there's no question there are side effects for alcohol's existence in our society. But we accept it as legal, and we accept that it's better for capitalists and entrepreneurs to be selling alcohol out in the open where we can all see it and we can all deal with the problems it creates head on, as terrible as they are at times. It's better that than to be enriching criminals who are going to sell it underground. And that's essentially what we're doing with marijuana, where if we keep it in a even a legal gray area, which I think is a fair description of what decriminalization does. You keep it in a legal gray area, all you're doing is you're continuing to empower the criminals. And that's my number one, is I like your number one argument for legalizing, which is some guy gets caught smoking a doob, and now he's got a felony on his record for the rest of his life and makes it hard to get jobs and get education and everything else. But the other thing is, I don't want to empower criminals anymore. Bring it out in the daylight. Let the capitalists handle it. We're all going to be better off.
Yeah, I don't want the mafia running the liquor store. I would much rather have the Empire. And the Empire is a great example of your point. At the Empire, when there's violence, there's accountability there. There's talks of stripping them of their liquor license. They're being watched. They're being monitored. And everyone has gone, maybe we need to re-examine the Empire.
Well, there's leverage, right? They have a liquor license. So if they're acting abusively or if they're acting irresponsibly, we can use the leverage of that liquor license and say, hey, get in line and be responsible.
And the people still have somewhere else to go. When your only vendor is the Gambino crime family, you deal with the Gambino crime family, and that's your only option.
Yeah.
If you don't want to go to the Empire, you can go to Rick's, which is a similar atmosphere, or you can go to Dempsey's, or you can go somewhere else. You have options.
David is referring to bars for people who maybe aren't from his community and don't know the names of these places. But we're talking about bars in Grand Forks, right? That's where all those are?
I live in Grand Forks. Those were Fargo examples.
Those are Fargo's? Okay. Yeah. See, I don't even know. You have to talk about Minot bars for me to understand. All right, so give me the timeline. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say that. You gave us the timeline for the measure. We've talked about what's going to be in it. People who are interested in getting involved at this point, maybe they want to collect signatures, maybe they want to have input on what the measure is going to look like. How do they do that? If people watching this are interested in getting involved.
Our current domain is legalizend2020.com. That's going to change probably to 2022 because of just reality. But right now it's legalizend2020.com. There's an option to join our mailing list. There's an option to contact your senators. There's an option to just basically shoot us an email and get involved. So that's how you join the mailing list. You guys aren't going to hear much beyond a post-mortem of the legislative session until July is usually when I say, and then it gets delayed, and we have to announce there's a small delay. But you won't hear much more beyond a legislative postmortem until July.
Yeah.
We're still waiting on some things, and this stuff takes time. So to everyone, please be patient.
Yeah.
Is what I always like to say.
Well, David's saying 2022. I mean, that's the timeline now. The 2022 general election ballots. That's November of next year, more than a year away. So this is going to be a slow process, but still, it's important for people to get on the mailing list, get involved, make your name known if you care about this. That's the way to go. Have you polled on this lately, David?
That's what we're doing soon. Trademark. We're doing it here in the next couple of weeks, and we're gonna poll on the home grow issue because we have to, and then we're gonna poll on a bunch of different things. It's gonna be a high quality poll. It's gonna be the same people we used to draft the 2020 measure that we never got to see on the ballot because of COVID. And that's really the saddest thing here, Rob, is we shouldn't be having this conversation because we should know where the people stand. But the draconian government policies of a global pandemic made it so that we don't get our day at the ballot box until 2022.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's really, think of how many people have criminal records because we didn't get to see where the people sit 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, it's frustrating to be sure, and I think this is an area where, like many areas, I'm not going to sit here and tell people that marijuana use that there's no societal problems that come from that. It is an inebriant. It can be abused like anything else. People who use it can act irresponsibly like anyone else. The thing is I instead of dealing with those things in the dark, I'd rather be dealing with them out in the light of day, as we do with alcohol. There's always going to be problems from the stuff like this, whether it's automobiles on the car, whether it's guns, whether it's any of this stuff, tobacco, alcohol. Some people are going to use it irresponsibly. The point is, but people are going to use it. People are going to use these things, and we're better dealing with these things out in the light of day than we are having them in the shadows. David, last word to you.
When you treat irresponsible use the same as responsible use, don't be surprised when people don't modify their behavior. When there's the same penalty for being a responsible user. A responsible user is someone who doesn't smoke and drive, someone who does it in the comfort of their own home. And the irresponsible user, don't be surprised when people act a little more irresponsible. It's why we see crime decline and workplace safety incidences decline in states that have legalized. And we did a full 10-year study from 2008 to 2018 of the states with legal marijuana, and the workplace safety incidents data and the crime data confirms it. In states that you legalize, you see decreases in workplace safety accidents, and you see decreases in crime because there's now a difference between responsible use and irresponsible use, and you can deal with the problems.
Well, and that's the thing too, is I think it was fashionable, particularly back when a lot of the legalization efforts in other states were still new. People would say, "Oh, look at Colorado's having terrible problems. Look at them," or these, they would point to these other states, and part of that was, well, yeah, you just took a product that was prohibited, but a lot of people were using anyway, and you brought it out into the daylight. So yeah, some of the yahoos thought it was the Wild West for a while, and there were some headaches. What we need is the long-term data, and if you look at the long-term data, I think it supports legalization. I just don't think there's any question. David, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this again because, again, it's a long process. The debate continues, but certainly appreciate your time today.
Yep, thank you for having me, Rob.